Hi, good morning to all of you. I am Prakash Kona from the English and Foreign Languages University. I'm an associate professor at the Department of English Literature, and this is my colleague, Assistant Professor Shardamani. We welcome you to a discussion on metaphysical poetry and on metaphysical poets. My first question is this, and it's a thought that has always bothered me, because we associate what is physical with the body. And meta is something outside the physical or outside the body. So what would be like, what is metaphysical poetry? I mean, can we imagine a poetry that is outside the body, that does not touch the body? What kind of poetry is that?
Thank you, Prakash, for that very beginning preliminary question. Welcome participants and also the viewers who are watching this program right now. To begin with, the word meta is actually used sometimes to convey a sense of beyond, but when it comes to the term metaphysical, which is very commonly used in English literature, to denote certain group of poets who arrived in the 17th century, which was a century of crisis, of calm, of tumult, of turbulence, because a lot of differences, lot of different things were happening all at the same time in Britain. Interestingly, when we look at metaphysical poetry, it is not just catering to the intellectual side of a person, or maybe talking about God, or talking about abstract concepts like devotion or trust or knowledge, but it also includes a sense of using language to create a feeling, rather what we normally associate with the hyperboles, the conceits which go along with the metaphysical poetry. Set of poets who wanted to show that there are realities which can be conveyed through hyperbolic language, which needn't be taken for difficult poetry, but words which were available to the poets at the minute, and it constantly or definitely reflected their sense of knowledge, their accumulated learning.
But interestingly, you must bear in mind that they did not see themselves as metaphysical. It is somebody else who called them metaphysical. Dryden dubbed them as metaphysical.
Right, exactly.
At, almost, half a century later, you see. And he dubbed them metaphysical owing to a certain abstract quality in their work.
Absolutely.
But do you really think that they are abstract poets or poets in some ways disconnected from reality? Or is this just a stereotype, you see? Because on the contrary, as you said earlier, that metaphysical poets were very much rooted in the 17th century, and they reflected the calm and the crisis and the turbulence and the turmoil, the disturbance, so on and so forth, which characterized the 17th century, which in some way can be considered the beginning of the modern age, in terms of English literature and English history.
The term metaphysical, as we discussed earlier, has a huge connotation, and to limit it to just 17th century group of poets is actually unfair, because there are metaphysical elements in almost many writers whose career spans many centuries. But now coming back to your original question, actually make a valid point here. You say that it's a term which has been discovered by accident. Somebody used the term for someone, and ultimately it forms a body, it forms a corpus of our literature today. I think it was initially used by Dryden to comment on Donne's poetry. He says he affects the metaphysics. That's the exact term I would like to use. The phrase goes, he affects the metaphysics, and Dryden accuses Donne of being highly hyperbolic, highly moved away from reality. At the same time, little later, when Johnson arrived on the scene, he uses the same term to describe Cowley's poetry, and that's how the buzz was on, and people caught the word metaphysical and they attach it to this particular group of writers. But interestingly, when you look at metaphysical traces in any poetry, it could be found in Shakespeare, it could be found in early romantics, it could be found in modern poets. And it can be, the whole mystic thing or the whole knowledge aspect has been retained not only in those people, but has been carried out through centuries. the term is umbrella term as we use it today, but on the whole it is a term which distinguished them from the others because they had the same style of writing, not one, not two, but there were many poets who arrived on the scene and they used the same kind of, with a difference of course, same kind of attitude towards the way they reflected on the world. But as I insist that there are traces of metaphysical poets, metaphysical elements in major poets or most poets we encounter these days.
No, can you name some of the poets and can you tell what are those characteristics that define metaphysical poets?
The famous ones, well, I would definitely begin with Donne because he stands apart and he actually initiates us into this whole metaphysical thing. And of his very famous poets, of course, we know Canonization is one of his best, and the most popular one is Death Be Not Proud. And the characteristics of metaphysical poetry is actually very interesting. You know, normally you have a poem which you add a lot to the poem while you are reading it, but a metaphysical poem does not allow you so much of space for your interference, for the simple reason that there is a voice of the poet in the text, and he is the one who is leading you through the poem. The language is highly hyperbolic, and thanks to the colonial attitude of Britain already in the air then, that these people tend to have the ideas of scientific temper and scientific attitude sprung in their poem here and there. It appears everywhere. The hyperbole of course has been questioned, the conceits and most people say that the poets take you through the poem, leaving very little for you to actually decipher or add to or supplement to the poem.
Okay, interestingly, I mean, there is a lot of exaggeration in their poetry. I mean, as you said, very hyperbolic and they took, I mean, a lot of elements from the scientific discoveries and their geographical achievements and so on and so forth, you see, that, so in that sense, they are very contemporary from what you have said, they are very much rooted in a certain historical framework. So while universal elements of this kind of writing, where you exaggerate a lot, can be found in all cultures, in all kinds of writing, but there is something specific to the metaphysical poets from England at this point in time. Look, I mean, just a question that's just to substantiate your point, you see, like even in the kind of poetry that we use or we write, I mean, like poetry in Urdu, for example, there is a lot of use of exaggeration, you see? Like a line like, I cannot live without you. It's a very metaphysical line, very abstract line. So in that sense, there is some metaphysical element or metaphysical kind of writing, even in Indian poetry.
Definitely,
for that.
Yes.
But in the sense, what makes them unique is that they were able to include whatever was happening around them. They were able to convert the scientific achievements and so on and so forth into metaphors and include them in their poetry. Anyway, I want to give this quote which you pointed out, I mean, from the Lives of Poets by Johnson. And
his reference to Cowley.
With reference to Cowley, Abraham Cowley, is it? About the beginning of the 17th century, appeared a race of writers that may be termed the metaphysical poets, of whom, in a criticism on the works of Cowley, it is not improper to give some account. But wit, abstracted from its effects upon the hearer, may be more rigorously and philosophically considered as a kind of discordia concourse, a combination of dissimilar images or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. Of wit, thus defined, we have more than enough. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons and allusions. Their learning instructs and their subtlety surprises, but the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased. Johnson does not sound very complimentary. I mean, he kind of seems to admire them on one hand, but he seems critical of that kind of abstract kind of writing. But it's popular in the 20th century. Why do you think so? Why is that readers and writers in the 20th century are fascinated by metaphysical poets?
For any literature to disseminate among people, I think takes a fairly good amount of time, and that's what happened with the metaphysical poets. At the same level, there is another assumption that when people say that they are heterogeneous ideas yoked together, I have a feeling they were not heterogeneous then. They have become heterogeneous through through interaction or through connotation or through what they mean today. Initially, I personally believe that they might have been quite familiar words to the audience, and nevertheless the poets used it. And hyperbole is a part of any culture or any language. Sometimes you ought to use them to make a valid point or to show the transcendence of the moment or the issue. Having said that, there is another aspect to this whole thing. As I said, the commonality definitely persists. The language was familiar to the metaphysical audience too, not only to the writer but to the audience as well. And with the influx of mathematicians on the scene, with the new scientific equipment which was being generated and
like
constantly used, yes, the compass and Galileo's achievements too, during the same time. So these things were common sense or common language or common behavioral instruments or whatever available to the public. So it might have become hyperbolic to use it later, but to that particular society it must have been an in thing, as I would rather put it. And yes, when we look at the very use of the literary form conceit, it's very interesting to see that the conceit, as some poet, as some critic says, it is not just about the justness of the metaphor or the justness of the verbal or the literary form. It is more to do with the striking aspect. What is it that makes the poetry readable is not only what is being said in the long run, but also what you associate with during your process of reading. And I think it was very contemporary then, because the scientific temper, as I mentioned, was in there among people, and lot of developments were happening side by side, and the country was ravaging through the disasters and the plague which took toll on the people, and the alternate governances, and also the fact that most of these poets had been to premier institutes to study, to finish their courses and then come back. So this was, I also guess, a popular way of disseminating knowledge and information, and I think it's a fantastic idea to have poetry which is so hyperbolic but also so informative, which leaves people with much more than regular lyric and poem and the quality which just touches your heart. So it is interesting to look at it like that.
They seem abstract, or everything looks like an exaggeration when we read from a more contemporary perspective. You see? It seems like, oh, this is such an exaggeration. But for the audience of that particular time period, it looks perfectly logical. You see? So we have to put them in a certain context, historical context, in order to understand them, yes, in order to appreciate them actually, why they are such great poets. But just to add to your point, I have another question. Look, while their metaphors or what you call conceits, or paradoxes, or
hyperboles.
Yeah, their hyperboles or their way of writing and speaking, seems rooted in material reality in terms of using discoveries and other achievements. But they also happen to be deeply spiritual poets,
yes,
like Donne himself, for example. There is a deep sense of spirituality in their kind of writing. But how do you think we can reconcile, or how do you think that the metaphysical poets could reconcile this kind of spirituality with material developments. I mean, do you think they succeeded in doing it, or do you think there is an inbuilt failure in attempting to do it?
I would not call it a failure, or I wouldn't call it a success, depending on its popularity or depending on its relevance we have at this point of time. But what is interesting is an attempt. It broke the rigmarole of the regular sonnets or the regular lyrical poetry which came after Elizabethan period, after Renaissance. Now coming back to your question, how to reconcile between the metaphors and the poetry as the poetry and the attempt it makes, to bridge the gap between spirituality and the person. Interestingly, when you look at the poem, as I told you, if let me take a very commonplace example, a very popular poem, Death Be Not Proud by Dan. He begins with a shocking revelation, and then he moves on towards encountering death face to face, until in the end he says, it is not I who die, but it is death who dies ultimately. Now that's a very popular poem, and it's available anywhere for those who are interested to have a look at it. I look at the metaphors only as instruments which will lead us to a larger theme. All said and done, because the metaphors are only vehicles of communication which will ultimately allow you to decipher the actual intent of the whole text. Now when Donne uses symbols like death, and he wants to take death by its horns, and when he when he questions death, ultimately there is a larger aspect to it, there is a thematic aspect to it, and that is a whole philosophy that it is not death which is defeating the human beings. Instead, it is vice versa, it is the other way around. So when we look at the larger themes, they are more appreciative, they are more mystical, they are more knowledge bound, and to be more appropriate, they are knowledge forms in themselves, because they attempt to unravel the mysticism, they attempt to look at the world not from the regular perspective of language, but at a higher level at which you can appreciate the higher forms too.
Let me from memory quote a couple of lines from two famous 20th century poets, T.S. Eliot and Yeats. And this one is a line from The Wasteland, where he says, burning, burning, I came to Carthage. And I always thought that this is a very metaphysical line. I mean, what does burning mean? Is it a spiritual kind of burning, or does burning stand for an act of purification, or in some sense some kind of a spiritual transformation? But at the same time, I mean, as you pointed out, they are rooted in some material basis. And one more is a line from Yeats. It goes like this: cold as March wind his eyes. Cold as March wind his eyes. And first thing that strikes the reader is, the first question that comes to mind is, how can the eyes be cold as March wind? Again, a very metaphysical kind of statement, a very metaphysical kind of metaphor. So, do you think that 20th century poets have been influenced by metaphysical poets? I mean, have been significantly influenced, because again we see there is a resurgence in the popularity of these kinds of metaphors. And as you said, a metaphor is a vehicle for communicating something. You see, that's what makes the language of poetry different from any other kind of language.
I think the social part to a poem or to literature is all evident. It is right there, and you just have to locate it, whether it is a poetry form, or maybe a novel, or work of fiction, or a drama. But the interesting thing is, there is nothing like one size fits all, and at the same time there is also a whole inventiveness happening with various genres of poetry, which make it all the more interesting, because you tend to borrow a lot from what has happened before, making it contemporary.
Right.
At the same time, you borrow what suits your frame of mind.
Right.
I think for a budding poet, what is more interesting is, what is it that he's looking for, and which particular form would suit his convenience. I think it's all about convenience, and if it is a highly, they have their different forms, different attitudes towards poem, and subsequently, how they want to ventilate their feelings depends on their frame and how much they have read and how much they think could do justice with any form they want to experiment.
So in that sense, metaphysical poetry is not just about 17th century England, It reflects many experiences across time and space, you see. And their influence can also be seen, I mean, as Sharda Mani pointed out, that even popular art, you see. I mean, the way it uses modern technology or the way it uses modern developments to express a certain personal experience, there is a metaphysical element to it, because that's what the poets of the 17th century England were attempting to do. In that sense, they are very modern poets, you see, because the way they used their exaggerations, the way they use their paradoxes, the way they use their metaphors is a reflection of a very contemporary or a very present day attitude. Poetry by its very nature is metaphysical. Some abstract element will be there in all poetry, because the way the phrase turns, the very turn of the phrase will make the difference. You see? How the metaphor captures reality, you see? How the metaphor is able to accommodate reality, you see? I mean, how the metaphor is able to trap that sense of reality within itself, you see? And kind of touch your imagination, you see? And so what Johnson says that the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. In the sense that complex ideas or very different ideas are forced to come together through violence. That is true of all poetry in general. Right?
And probably what appeared heterogeneous to Johnson may not have been heterogeneous in its
Very
own
true,
way.
You see, I mean, Johnson kind of tends to see it from the 18th century perspective, when everything was more clear and more moralistic. So in that sense, the metaphysical poets are not very moralistic. Although they are very spiritual, their sense of morality is much more open-ended. And so to that extent, they are more 20th century or more contemporary than the 18th century poets that Johnson stands for, of getting through the metaphysical poets. I mean, what is the best way to read a metaphysical poet? Like, how can you appreciate their poetry? I mean, what is the best way to appreciate their poetry or to unlock the metaphors? Like, you think it's important that a student has a background in the history of that period? Or can someone without a background actually relate him or herself with the experience of these poets?
Very interestingly, done is prescribed at the secondary level at most, as part of curriculum for most schools. So when he can be read by, let us say, 13-year-old or 14-year-olds, then definitely a person who has just with a pre-university degree or somebody who's into his bachelor's or master's should be able to comprehend more out of the metaphysicals. But what is also interesting is, the metaphors they appear simple to me for the simple reason that I know what they mean. So, the metaphors are concrete instead of abstract, although the theme is abstract, so the metaphors used are concrete.
Themes like death, for example,
death,
that
for
you spoke
example,
about. Yeah,
and they are very personal. They are almost as if the poet is unraveling his heart. So I think there is hardly anything left to the reader to supplement the text with. So the reader has enough resources, and the text will take him along. As I mentioned earlier, it shouldn't be a big deal to actually sit with some kind of a paraphrase or sit with some additional material. The text on its own is self-sufficient. So a student can have or a person can have, because the idea or the theme is also clearly stated. There are no ends which are not filled here. it's complete in its own, and all a person has to do who wants to embark on this kind of metaphysical project is just to read those lines, and the meaning is very evident in the text.
So it's important that you read these poems with an open mind. The best way to appreciate a poem, is to begin by reading it. Eventually you imbibe or you absorb that experience of the poet, because unless you read it with an open mind, you'll always be under the impression that this is abstract poetry, or this is not the way poetry should be. But as Sharada Mani pointed out, that it's not abstract really, they are very concrete metaphors, that unless you get into them, the themes are abstract, death, love, suffering, these are abstract themes. But the poetry itself is quite concrete and a reflection of what you go through in day-to-day life. So I would like to conclude the first part of the discussion with what Johnson says, that ideas are yoked by violence together, but that is not just, that is true of any poetry and not just metaphysical poets, you see. So in that sense, if they did it in a more obvious way, it's only because they understood the role of the metaphor or the role of exaggeration and the role of poetry in general to communicate a certain message. In the second part of the program, we'll actually take a couple of poems from John Donne and from Andrew Marvell, and we'll illustrate our point further about metaphysical poets. Thank you very much.